From the University of Colorado at Boulder, Rocky Mountain Animal Defense presents Empty Cages, Animal Rights and Why They Matter.
Thank you, Lisa, for a very kind introduction. And Alan, thank you very much for helping arrange the logistics and all those who helped with publicity. I thank you. And I thank all of you for coming, because I know that we are all busy people. We all have important things to do. And so taking the time to come here rather than be doing something else that's important for your life and important for your interest means so much to me personally, and so much to my wife Nancy, and so much to those of us who are involved in the struggle for animal rights, because you voted with your feet here, you've come. I want to encourage all of you to make connections with the local organizations if you haven't already done so, because we all know the axiom about thinking globally and acting locally. There really are problems right here that need to be tended to, beginning with this dog lab right here. I'll be happy to come back when the dog lab's closed to help you celebrate, so you just let me know when that day comes. I also, though, want to encourage you to think about the Culture and Animals Foundation. There's information about our organization out there, and our annual festival, which Lisa's been coming to for at least the last 5 years. It's a wonderful opportunity, and we'd appreciate seeing all of you again in Raleigh, North Carolina. That's east of here, as I call it. I want to see if my machine is working here. This is always the moment of truth. It'll take a minute to warm up. But it is a great pleasure for me to be here and to meet with all you folks and to have the opportunity to share my ideas and my life experience with you. I personally don't think that I have the power to change anybody's life in the next half hour or so. I know that there are these evangelical meetings where people come and they make our decision and they change their life, but I don't think I have that power to do that. I don't think animal rights, in fact, is an idea like that. I think some people are born to the idea. I've met people who, from the very earliest awareness, from their earliest memories, they knew that they were on the side of the animals. They had that compassion, that empathy for animals, and they didn't have to be taught that. They didn't have to be convinced to be that way. They just kind of were born that way. And I'm sure some of you are in this room. I'm sure there always are some people like that in this room. Then there are other people who have these like road to Damascus experiences. They're Paul one day and Saul the next, if you know what I mean. Something happens. And it's not like an argument, or it's not like a process. It's just they're transformed. They see something. They go someplace. They go to a slaughterhouse, for example, or they see a film about trapping, or about fur ranching, and they're just changed, just like that. But then there are the rest of us that aren't born that way and aren't transformed in a minute. I call us the muddlers. We just kind of muddle along. And we learn this, we learn that, and we do this, we do that. And there's a long process. In a way, the movement makes us rather than we make the movement. And I've certainly been a muddler in my life. I wasn't born that way, I didn't have a transforming experience. It's just one thing and then another thing and then another thing, and then you end up someplace and you look back and you don't recognize who you are. And you don't know how that happened. And so you try to reconstruct it. So I thought I would share with you some of the things that have happened in my life, in my journey, and then also share some of the ideas that are the substance of my position as a philosopher. I was born in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, as was Nancy, when Pittsburgh was the steel capital of the world. And it's a part of Pittsburgh that we honor to this day, as all you sports fans know, by having a team called the Pittsburgh Steelers. Go Steelers! Go Steelers, right. And especially those of you who are Denver Bronco fans, I'm sorry, go Steelers. And when we were living in Pittsburgh at the time, Pittsburgh, as I said, was the steel capital of the world, and the mills worked 7 days a week, 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. And the pollution was so bad that there were some days, especially when the sky was really heavy, which is very often in Pittsburgh, I might say that you could look out and you couldn't tell whether it was 12 o'clock midnight or 12 o'clock noon, as in this picture here. That's what it was like to live in Pittsburgh at the time. My mother and father were born in Pittsburgh. They're now deceased. But my mother and father were both born in Pittsburgh, and they came from poor working class families. My mother went to the 7th grade, and that was the end of her education, formal education. My father went to the 8th grade. That was the end of his formal education. And after that, they had to go out and get a job and work to help support their family, meet life's necessities. So that's the kind of environment I was born into. I didn't come from any kind of blue-collar or blue-blood family. I have only blue-collar blood in my veins, I always say. There's nothing royal or anything. And I was the first person on both sides of my family, both my father's side and my mother's side, to go to college. I mean, that was something that never happened in that working-class family there. So for my mom and dad, when they first got married, they came from this hardship. They got married and the country went into a depression, the Great Depression. And there are people here, I see some of you who are old enough to understand what I'm about to say. This is hard for younger people to understand. But my mother and father never left the depression. I mean, they were born, they came through that depression, and they knew what it was like to scrimp and save and do without, and didn't know whether you're going to be able to buy bread tomorrow, and they felt that way their whole life. They lived that way. They scrimped and saved, never got out of it. But they were terribly proud of their children and totally supportive of everything we did. But for them to have a house, this is the home where I was born in Pittsburgh's North Side, to actually have a house for them was an amazing thing. This is where they rented this, and eventually they built a home. But it was an amazing thing. The animals that I knew when I was growing up in those circumstances in an industrial center in Pittsburgh were companion animals. This is a dog of ours. That good-looking guy is me there. I mean, one time we had like 30 inches of snow in Pittsburgh. It was one of the biggest snowfalls ever. And it was such an incredible thing to happen, because when you have that kind of snowfall, all the ordinary rules of day-to-day life were suspended. So like dogs who always had to stay in were allowed to run all over the place. And this is one of my favorite photographs in my whole life, because this dog we had, who was confined mainly to a small yard and had very little freedom and very little excitement, she was allowed to go out and run in the snow. And she was just so happy. And it's, as I say, one of my fondest memories. But I had no connection with animals. My mother and father, the one luxury they allowed themselves was food. And they were it was an American home. And for them coming through the Depression, to be able to put meat on the table, where in the Depression you couldn't have that, you couldn't afford that. Be able to put that on the table meant my father was succeeding. It was more than nutrition. It was a symbol of success. And so I always say, I dined enthusiastically at the trough of tradition. I mean, if you put a steak on the table, I ate it. Pork chops, lamb chops, turkey, chicken, everything. They tried to sneak liver in. I never did like liver, but I mean, they tried to sneak liver in. I didn't like that, but I ate everything, enthusiastically. In fact, then, when the time came when I went off to college and had to earn money to help pay to go to college, I took the job that was available. I worked in a butcher shop. My job was to grind the meat, and my job was to pack the chickens and put the chickens on the rotisserie, that kind of thing, and to put all the cold cuts out and display them. And there was a thing called city chicken. You made city chicken out of small pieces of pork and small pieces of veal, and you put it on a stick. I would do that. I wasn't a great skilled butcher like the really good butchers. I was just a kind of novice butcher. But that's what I did to earn money. 50 cents an hour I made. It was good money back then. Best money I could make anyhow. And I always say, I didn't find butchering bloody, I found it bloody hard. I had no moral qualms about it, no aesthetic qualms about it. I had eyes and did not see, and ears and did not hear. It was all around me. I was surrounded by it. But it moved me not. Not at all. What did move me, in fact, was not animals. It wasn't like I looked in their eyes. At this point in my life, it was transformed. It was something else. It was really something going on in my head. I'm now a university professor, and there's a war going on in Vietnam. And people the age of my students, I'm a young professor. I'm a young professor back there. But students the age of my students, young men and women the age of my students were coming home in body bags, day after day after day, in a war that Nancy and I thought was totally unjustified. And so we became activists in the anti-war movement during the Vietnam period. And we, along with other people, organized the state of North Carolina, North Carolinians against the war. And we worked in the ways that we could to try to bring pressure on our government to bring an end to the war. The images of war we saw, the casualties, the innocent civilians that were being caught up in the war, and the soldiers on both sides that were dying because of the war. And I thought to myself at the time, I'm a trained philosopher. I should be able to do something to contribute to this movement in addition to going out and protesting as we did. I mean, I'm back there in the right-hand corner up there in the big demonstration in Washington. This was this great demonstration, great historical moment in the anti-war movement. I should be able to do something as a philosopher rather than as an organizer and a street activist and a protester and all that. So I thought, I'll start reading. That's the first thing you do as a thinker. You say, well, I'll start reading what other people have said about war and violence and aggression. And what happens here, if you take that path, this is inevitable. The day will come when you'll go someplace, a bookstore or a library, and you'll reach up and you'll pull down a book and it'll say, Gandhi, an autobiography, the story of my life. My experiments with truth, he talks about it, the subtitle, My Experiments with Truth, Gandhi. Now Gandhi, if you don't know anything about him, I encourage you to rent the film from Blockbusters, Gandhi. It's a great film. One thing it's not good about, it doesn't mention anything about Gandhi's animal views, which is very disappointing about the film, because it was essential to Gandhi. His animal views were essential to who he was and what he stood for. But Gandhi was a man of great simplicity. He was a saint compared to what I could be in terms of what he was, the austerity of his life. When he died, you may know this, when he died, he had his glasses, he had a wooden bowl, he had his sandals, and he had a dhoti. And that was the extent of his earthly possessions. He lived such a life of simplicity. Well, I'm not into that much simplicity myself, and I wasn't even then at the time. But he did ring true to me because he had a view about the war that was helpful to me. He had a view about violence. He said, look, violence is the intentional use of force to hurt someone. That's what violence is. You're trying to hurt somebody using this force. And so the idea was that Gandhi thought, of course Gandhi thought it was always wrong to use violence. He was a pacifist. He thought that if in the face of the Nazis, the thing to do was to try to reason with them. He thought that in the face of someone attacking your child, that it would be impermissible for you to raise a hand. I'm sorry, but I'm just too much of a blue-collar person to think that way, I think. It must be the influence of the mills and the mines on me or something. But I never was able to buy into Gandhi's absolute pacifism. But I did understand what he was saying about the notion of violence, and that was what was wrong with the war. Because here we were using violence, and we couldn't justify hurting people. The onus is on you to justify the use of violence, because you're intentionally hurting somebody. And that's what we thought. Well, we couldn't do that. And so it was a key to my being able to lecture in the anti-war movement and talk about the philosophical foundations of the anti-war movement, short of Gandhi. But the one thing I was not suspecting in Gandhi was this. he said, violence, the intentional use of force to hurt someone, doesn't stop at the boundaries of our species. We use violence against animals every day. And unless we can justify it, it's wrong. And in particular, he raised this question about food. Remember, here's this guy who's dined at the trough, enthusiastically the trough of tradition, and is cutting up the chicken and all that. And here's this guy from India saying across generations, across time and place to me from the page saying, what about the animals? Here you are, you're this big anti-war person doing all these protests because people are using violence that can't be justified, and what are you doing? Gandhi's argument was pretty simple when it came to the question of what we should do with respect to animals. He said, look, violence is wrong when it's unnecessary. The slaughter of animals is violent. The eating meat is unnecessary, and therefore eating meat is wrong. That's, in a nutshell, was Gandhi's argument. So I said, well, okay, I'll think about this. I hadn't thought about it before. I hadn't thought about it. I knew something, and I knew some things I didn't like. I knew that if you went to Korea, this is still true, or to China, you can go to these markets and you can say, literally, I'll have that dog. I'll have that one. On the left, that dog. And the proprietors of those places will take that dog back, and they will beat that dog to death, and they will slay it and skin it, and you'll have it for lunch or dinner. I thought, well, I mean, I know I'm not supportive of that. But what about that? I said, well, look, I mean, here I am eating this parts of pigs, and these pigs haven't done anything to me. It's not like I have to use violence to defend myself against a pig attack. And I'll tell you what I did, though, and this was hard for me, and I encourage everybody to do this. I went to slaughterhouses, and I saw what happens to pigs at slaughterhouses, and I saw the violence at slaughterhouses. And I started looking at that hamburger, and I thought, what has this cow ever done to me that I have to support people using violence against this animal? And I went to slaughterhouses, and I saw the violence done to these animals. Chicken's the same thing. As you know, you go to the slaughterhouse and you see it. So, for me, this is the kind of transformation that was occurring to me. Slow. Reluctant. I mean, it's like kicking and screaming, if you know what I mean. I didn't want to give up what I was used to and what I enjoyed. Who wants to give up what you're used to and what you enjoy? I mean, that's a struggle. I didn't want to give that up. But what happened to me is I started to put a face on what was in front of me. I knew dogs, and I started to come to look into the eyes and into the face of pigs, and into the eyes and the face of cows, and into the eyes and the face of chickens. And Gandhi said to me, Professor Regan, that fork you have is a weapon of violence the way you're using it. And you're supposed to be this big anti-war, and you can't stop the war. Well, stop your war, Tom Regan. Stop your war against these animals. And that's what we did. We kind of just started to move from one anti-war movement to another anti-war movement, from the anti-war movement in the Vietnam period to the undeclared war against animals that goes on every day, 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, like those mills in Pittsburgh at their height. So we became vegetarians. Nancy and I, lacto-ovo vegetarians at that time, no meat, but we continued to use dairy products, and of course cheese. Cheese was a great thing for me. That was the hardest thing for me. I mean, if you had like put a round of Stilton cheese the size of a tower, I'd eat it all. I mean, it was just terrible. I like cheese so much, and the riper and the fouler, the more I liked it. So it was a struggle. to try to give that up, to try to move on to, of course, the notion of being in the world as a vegan, where you try your best to avoid meat and any other animal products. And I just want to say this, though, that this is an impossibility. It's impossible to be in the world and not be implicated in the deaths of animals. It's impossible. As long as we breathe, we're implicated in the deaths of animals. When I say I wear this cotton shirt or this synthetic ultra suede jacket or these vinyl shoes, they're all implicated in the death of animals. Every one of them. Everything I've got on here. Cotton is the most chemically intensive, one of the most chemically intensive monocultural crops in the world. Animals are killed every time that the cotton is planted. Animals are killed every time there's a chemical runoff. Vinyl is a petrochemical byproduct. Think about the Valdez or whatever it was. Think about oil spills. Think about the marine life that dies. We're all implicated in the death of animals. There's blood on all our hands at the end of the day. So there's nothing pure about being a vegan. It really isn't, and I think we just have to get used to that. What we can say, though, is, look, we don't support those industries whose very purpose for being in the world is to kill animals. That's where we draw the line. That's what we're trying to disassociate ourselves from that, from industries whose very reason for being is the destruction of animal life. No, we won't do that. But that we're implicated, that remains true. I sometimes picture it like there's a big web, like a big spider web. I call it the web of evil. Sometimes that can be fun to be around, but anyhow, here's the web of evil. Here's the web of evil, and what I'm suggesting is picture it this way. As long as we're alive, we're in that web someplace. We're implicated in the evil of the world, implicated in the bad stuff going on. Our challenge is to try to get as far from the center of that web as we can. Just keep crawling out as far away from the center as we can. And that's what I think is part of what we do when we just simply put our foot down and say we will not support those industries whose reason for being is to kill animals, destroy them. We try to get away from the center. What happens when you become aware of one thing about animals is you start to become aware of other things. You take one step, you take two. The trick, of course, is to have people take the one step. Then they'll start walking on their own. But the real trick for any activist in the movement, where we're trying to bring about change, is how do I enable this person to take that first step? When Nancy and I were fairly young in our marriage, early in our marriage, I bought her a nice little fur hat. It was the cutest little fur hat. This shows my age again, but there was a movie called Dr. Zhivago. And in it there's a woman named Julie Christie. And she would wear this cute fur. Nancy looked more beautiful than Julie Christie in this little fur hat. But of course, what happens is that this is earlier in life, and so we start learning about the leg hold trap and what happens to animals that are caught in a leg hold trap, and how they can die, either bleed to death or die of neglect out there because the trapper hasn't come around to collect the wares and the treatment of them. And of course, ranches are just if you learn about fur ranching, it's almost unbelievable what goes on in fur ranches. But that was another thing we learned. And we learned about animals in science. And see, I didn't know anything about this. When I came through school, in high school and in college, they said, here's a worm, cut it up, I cut it up. Here's a frog, cut it up, I cut it up. I mean, I didn't say no to any of that stuff. I didn't like it. But I didn't raise any kind of conscientious objection to it. And in fact, nobody in my generation that I ever remember did that. I remember somebody passing on, but it wasn't like it was a conscientious pass on. Boom, they're gone. But I began to learn about dogs being used in burn experiments and sensory deprivation research and neurological research on cats. And I did what any philosopher could do. What am I going to do? I'm going to start writing about this stuff. I've reached a point where I said, but how can I use my training as a philosopher again as part of the movement, part of my activism. I don't like my life schizoid. I don't like my life divided against itself. If I'm a thinker, I want to think about what I care about. And if I care about things, I want to think about them. I want my life some kind of harmony there. So as I said, I did the thing that seemed natural to me. I tried to use my philosophical training to add to what was being done in the movement, including this most recent book, Defending Animal Rights. But what I thought at the time, and I still think this is true, that when we see all the stuff that's going on with animals, from the prairie dog to the laboratory to the trapping to the factory farming and entertainment, we see all this stuff that's going on. I think there really are three basic responses to it. One is indifference. You simply see it and you say, yeah, so what? And I've met a lot of people like that, and I'm sure you have too. They just are not moved by it. They're just not moved by it. Maybe they're not ready to be moved by it. Maybe there's a time when they'll be moved by it. But sometimes they can see it, have eyes and not see, as I said, have ears and not hear. It just doesn't register with them. So what? Or they'll say, oh, they're more important things. These people who say they're more important things don't do anything. Have you noticed that? There are more important things to care about. Oh, are there? I mean, and are you working for to help children? Are you working to help the poor? Are you working to? No, I'm not golfing actually. I mean, yeah, but there are a lot of people who would respond with indifference, and they're a real problem, I think. But then there are people who the second basic idea is reform, and the third one is abolition. I must say just a little bit about this. Reform is where you have the response you say, that steel jaw lake trap is really horrible. That's horrible. You know what we have to do? We have to pad those jaws. We have to make that trap more humane. But by God, we have to keep trapping those animals. Or they'll say, in the case of like battery hen operations where you have 7 or 8 or 9 hens in a space as big as a newspaper. You open a newspaper, and now you imagine you have 7 or 8 hens in a cage that big, and they live there for a year like that. And you say, oh no, we shouldn't do that. 5 in a cage, that's maximum. So in other words, we want to still keep doing that, but you want to reform it. And then the third response is abolition. You want to say, there's something rotten about this completely, and it should be eliminated completely. That's the only adequate response to this. What's going on here? This is the abolitionist position. That it's not like you can fix it up by making the cages bigger or putting fewer animals in the cage, or you're putting pads on the. The only adequate response is to just stop doing this stuff. Now, I must say, see, early in my thinking about it, I was a reformist. Of course, when I was in my early, I was indifferent to it all. But then I went through this period where I was reformist, where I thought, well, yeah, it really is horrible the way we do some of these things, but as long as we minimize the suffering, no unnecessary suffering, it'll be okay. And people say to me, well, how far did you go with that at the time? And I tell them the following, and I'm not proud to say this, but it's true. That I once defended General Motors when they did impact tests to test safety belts using live baboons. You know, it was going to save human life. Think of the children. So, the more I thought about it, this is where my thought was driving me. It's not what I wasn't looking for this conclusion at all. It's funny, it wasn't like I believed it and then I started looking for the arguments to support it. It wasn't like that at all. I didn't believe it, but the arguments, the philosophy I was developing kept pushing me until I began to think, oh, okay, that's what I'm thinking about animal rights. That's what I'm thinking about here. I know, because if animals do have rights, the only adequate response is not indifference and it's not reform, it is abolition. the whole bloomin' thing is wrong. That's my lawyer. So, let me talk a little bit about the philosophical part of it. And this is where I said, I don't think I can convince you of the truth that animals have rights, but what I can do is try to explain what I'm talking about here. There are different types of rights that people talk about. There are legal rights, of course, like the legal right to vote, the legal right to marry, the legal right to divorce, to own or inherit property. And the thing about these rights is that they are created by people. We make these legal rights by passing laws and, or by other legislative means, and that they are obviously not universal or equal. The right to vote was not always shared by women or people of color. The right to vote is not shared by other people in other parts of the world today. Rights change over time. Legal rights change over time, depending on what people do, depending on what legislative bodies do, what despots do, what laws are made. Laws change over time. Moral rights, on the other hand, when we talk about these, we're talking about something that are rights that are not created by people. What we're trying to do is talk about rights that are universal and equal. If you look at the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights, when they talk about the right to be not to be tortured, the right to freedom of religion, the right to freedom of assembly, the right to petition your government, when they talk about this, they're declaring that these rights belong to all human beings. All human beings, whether they're recognized as legal rights in a particular country or not. They're trying to say, and they belong to all of us equally, whether our nation recognizes them or not. And a large part of the political struggle in any country is to transform the law so that the moral rights of individuals are recognized as legal rights. So that the right to vote, the right to be spared torture, the right to freedom of assembly, and the rest, that those rights that we have as moral rights are recognized as legal rights. A lot of history is like the struggle involved there. When we're talking about the rights of animals, then primarily what we're trying to do is talk about their moral rights. Legal rights they don't have. No animal has any serious legal right today. Animals have laws where they're covered by laws. There are laws that cover animals. But no animal has legal standing in this country. You can't go into court and represent an animal. I mean, it's not something that happens. And in fact, as you know, just a few weeks ago, the Congress of the United States passed as an amendment to the Farm Bill a provision that said that birds and rodents are explicitly excluded from the provisions of the Animal Welfare Act. Between 95 and 99% of the animals used in research in America are birds and rodents. But moral rights have various characteristics that I think are important for us to understand. And the first thing is that they have a relation to obligations. And I always use this analogy that think about a coin. And rights and obligations are two sides of the same coin. That is, if you have a right to life, then I have an obligation, that's the other side of the coin, I have an obligation to respect your life. If you have a right to bodily integrity, then I have an obligation to respect your bodily integrity. That's why it's important, see, as soon as I recognize your right, I have to recognize my obligation. And that's why you have lots of conflicts and contests about who has what rights. Because if you recognize this right, then you're buying into your obligation. That means we must behave in a certain way. So if all Americans have a right to health care, affordable quality health care, if we do, all Americans have that right, that means we have an obligation. And that's why a lot of people want to say, I don't want to recognize that right because that means I have to do something. The other thing second thing about rights, at least the rights I'm talking about, is this notion of no trespass. It's like, think about my right to bodily integrity. And what I'm suggesting is think about that right like this, that as I walk through the world, there's this like invisible sign that says, keep your hands off this body. It already belongs to somebody. This space is already occupied. by me. And no one is to trespass, no one is to enter this geography, this geographical space, my body, without the owner's permission. That's the idea of the integrity of the body. So the idea, if you were to do something harmful to my body, you'd be violating my right. And also failing to fulfill your obligation, assuming I haven't done anything to merit that. And the other thing I want to mention about rights is this notion of Trump. I've got my little props here. And I've got to get a better example, and I hope somebody will help me, because this shows again how old I am. My example comes from the game Bridge, which nobody plays anymore, apparently. That's one of the ways I got through college. In addition to working as a butcher, I won a lot of money playing bridge. But anyhow, bridge is what's called a trump game, where you basically bid and determine whether clubs, diamonds, hearts, or spades are going to be the trump card. And in a game like that, then what happens is, suppose diamonds are trump, and somebody, just before people were playing, somebody plays the queen of spades. That's a pretty big spade. And then the next person plays the king of spades. This is a very big spade. And then the person plays the ace of spades. And in a game like bridge, if diamonds are trump and I don't have any spades, this card here is more powerful than the queen, it's more powerful than the king, it's more powerful than the ace. It wins. It wins the trick. It's more powerful. It wins the trick. Well, the thing about rights, then, is this. When we say that they're trump, what we're trying to say is that in the moral game, the rights of the individual, your rights, my rights, who have had rights, the rights of the individual are more important than other powerful moral considerations. And in particular, respecting the rights of the individual is more important than any obligation we have to benefit society, to benefit other people. We're not justified in violating the rights of an individual in order to benefit somebody else, even society at large. There are famous examples of this. Remember the Tuskegee experiment. You're familiar with the Tuskegee experiment, where hundreds of African American sharecroppers were given syphilis and not treated for it, so they could see what happened. When they told them, "You got bad blood. You have to take this medicine." It was no medicine. It was a sugar pill, and they watched them die. They watched them die from syphilis, so that they could learn something about the progression of the disease that might be useful for other people, syphilis sufferers, in the future. But it's a violation of the rights of the individual to do that. That's what we're trying to say when we say that individuals have rights, when we talk about ourselves. So that's why, again, see, if animals have rights, the only adequate response is abolition. We can't say, well, look, we like to eat them. That's not a sufficiently good reason to violate anybody's rights. We benefit from doing the research. That's not a sufficiently good reason for doing the research. It's a tradition to do it. It's not a sufficiently good reason to violate anybody's rights. If animals have rights, the only adequate response to raising them for food, the only adequate response to using them in research, the only adequate response in using them for items of fashion is to stop doing it, if they have rights. But of course, then the question is, do they have rights? That's the fundamental question. Do they? And that's the question that I explore at length in my writings. And I'll just simply say, look, there are factual questions we have to ask to make any headway here. What are other animals like physiologically? What are they like anatomically? What are they like psychologically? And here's what we know. Here's what we know. The animals we raise for food, the animals we trap and ranch for fur, the animals we use in laboratories for scientific purposes, the animals we train to entertain us, they're like us, and we're like them. Physiologically, anatomically, psychologically. Here's what I mean by psychologically. This is one of the most important elements of my philosophy, but I think it's just common sense. It's not like, oh gosh, this is like really abstract stuff. I think it's really just plain common sense. Other animals, these animals I'm talking about, are in the world. They're aware of the world. They're aware of what happens to them. What happens to them matters to them. Let me do that again. They're in the world. They're aware of the world. They're aware of what happens to them. What happens to them matters to them. It makes a difference to how their life goes for them, how their story unfolds, what it's like to be them. Those dogs in the pictures, and those cows in the pictures, and those chickens in the pictures, there's a them there. There's a somebody there behind those eyes, living in the world, living their life. And what happens then matters to them. And then see, in that respect, they're just like us. We're in the world. Where are the world? What happens to us matters to us. We're the same, fundamentally the same, us and them. And so, somebody says, well, yeah, okay, there is that similarity, I grant you that, but look, here's who has rights. Here's who has rights. Those who are rational and autonomous, this is what the philosophers say, most of the philosophers. This is what most of the philosophers say. This is like the standard view, I swear, amongst philosophers. And rational means this, that you can think about what you're doing. You can say, oh, if I do this, that will happen. Or if I do this, that'll happen, and you'll be affected. And, I mean, I can think about what I'm doing if I'm rational. And autonomous means, having thought about it, I can say, I'll do this rather than that. I can make a free choice. I can make that free choice. That's who has rights. You happen to have them. You happen to have them. All of us happen to have them. Isn't that convenient? Isn't that nice? So keep your hands off my body, respect my life, grant me my freedom, because I'm rational and autonomous. Isn't it interesting? I'm making the argument, and it so happens that I get covered by the conclusion. So it just works out that way. But so this is the way. And see, all you can do is say, that's very interesting. That's very interesting. Except there are just a lot of human beings that don't have rights then. Because there are a lot of human beings that aren't rational and autonomous. I'm not talking about anybody in this room, but I mean, but there are a lot of human beings that just can't put it together. They don't have the mental wherewithal to think that way and to think through choices. They just don't have that capacity. But we certainly don't say, and I mean, I'm a great children's advocate and advocate of the mentally disabled and all that, but we don't say, well, they don't have rights because they can't do that. We don't say that. I wouldn't for a minute say that. I mean, they do have rights and should be protected in my view. So you can raise a standard. Here's the plot. You can raise a standard. You can say, here's the standard for having rights. And you can pretty much guarantee that no animal is going to satisfy it. You can't. But a lot of human beings aren't going to satisfy it either. Now that's your dilemma, isn't it? Because especially the people who are against animal rights, they don't want to say, well, children don't have rights either. They don't want to have. They're not saying the mentally disabled don't have rights. So their problem is one of consistency. Here's another favorite of the philosophers, those who are self-aware. They go like this. We're not only in the world, aware of the world, and aware of what happens to us, and what happens to us matters to us. We know we're in the world. We're aware of being in the world. We're aware of ourselves being in the world. We're self-aware beings. Other animals aren't. Therefore, we have rights and they don't. Something like that. Well, I can only tell you that, I mean, there's this controversy about whether some animals are self-aware. There are these mere things with some non-human primates and other sorts of things. I personally think the animals are self-aware, and I have an argument to that effect in the case for animal rights. Any animal is able to act intentionally. An animal says, I'm going to do this now in order to get that in the future, even if it's a short future. I'm going to do this now in order to get this banana that I want, is able to say, I'm going to be the person, I'm going to be the one that gets a banana in the future. And that requires self-awareness, it seems to me. But even if it is the case that animals aren't self-aware, there are a lot of human beings who aren't self-aware. And again, you can raise a standard that animals are not going to meet if you want to. But a lot of human beings are not going to meet it either. Or you can say, those who have immortal souls. I always love this. I have to say, I've always said too, I hope I have an immortal soul. I think that would be delightful. I mean, it'd be just really interesting to see what happens after this life. I mean, it would really kind of be interesting. It'd be more interesting than not seeing what happens after this life. So I would think so. I mean, I'm all in favor of immortal souls. But it's obviously here you're just making things more difficult for trying to defend the difference between animals and human beings. It seems to me to bring in these kinds of issues that are so unsettled and so uncertain. That doesn't seem to really ground the opposition to animal rights very, very well. Plus, I always like to mention this argument of C.S. Lewis's, who is C.S. Lewis, of course, is one of the great Christian theologians of the 20th century. A really wonderful thinker. And so Lewis says, you know, I actually do think that animals don't have immortal souls. I think human beings are unique and have immortal souls, and that's why I'm an anti-vivisectionist. What? He says, yes, here's why I'm an anti-vivisectionist. They don't have immortal souls. That means that there's nothing that's going to happen after they die that's going to make up for any bad that they experienced in this life. You and I, on the other hand, I mean, we die and then good things happen to us. But animals, they die and nothing happens to them. It's annihilation. So that means that the bad stuff that happens to them is not going to be made up for in the future. That means that instead of doing bad stuff for them now, we should do all the good stuff we can for them. That means we should get them out of labs, for example. They don't belong there. No Christian should tolerate vivisection. I think the idea is the most plausible view is this notion of being a subject of a life, the thing I was talking about earlier, being in the world, aware of the world, aware of what happens to you matters to you, your story unfolding, you're somebody. You have a little story going on here. It's called your little biography is going on here. You're a dog, you're a cat, or a human being. That seems the most plausible. That's what children are like. That's what the mentally disabled are like. It's not like we're saying anything excluding them. It seems to me that that's going to end up being the most adequate thing. If that's the most adequate way of thinking about the foundations of rights, not rational autonomy, not self-aware, not immortal souls, but who's a somebody rather than a something, then animals have rights, including the right to life, right to bodily integrity, most fundamentally the right to be respected. People object to this. They say, look, animals don't respect, don't understand rights. Yeah, they say, oh, they don't understand rights. You go home and you get your dog. Really, you go home and you get your cat. Or you go home and you look at your drawer and have a conversation and say, what's your opinion about rights? Some people think they're valid claims. Others think they're entitlements. You understand, there's some are legal and some are more. They're not going to get it. They don't understand. So they say, well, and since they don't understand it, they don't have any. It's, to me, that's as silly as saying, go home and talk to your dog about genes, genetic makeup, and see what you get from them, and see if they say, well, I'm not sure about recombinant DNA, and they're not going to get it. You say, well, they don't have any genes then either. They don't understand. If they don't understand it, they don't have it. That's just the most absurd idea, it seems to me, to think that you have to understand something in order to have it. Oh, animals don't respect our rights. Well, it's like, what, the cows are running through Boulder? I mean, the pigs are coming down from up north invading Boulder. It looks to me like animals aren't doing that. I guess what people have in mind here is something like, well, I was once walking across the Serengeti, and wouldn't you know, a lion came charging at me. Well, I guess what I want to say in something like that is that is really something more philosophical than just saying pigs invading from the north. And it is that it is true that our animals can do things that are harmful to us, and that sometimes happens, and sometimes tragically so. Animals do things that are harmful to us. But animals are incapable of violating our rights, because animals are not morally responsible for what they do, any more than a one-year-old child who accidentally fires a revolver and kills their mother is morally responsible for the murder. Doesn't understand, is not morally responsible. Only morally responsible agents can violate somebody's rights. So animals can do things that are harmful to us, but of course they can't violate or respect our rights. It makes no sense. They don't respect one another's rights. Look at the lion and the wildebeest. Oh, it's not like the lion, but the same kinds of considerations apply here. Animals are not appropriate thinking this way because they're not morally responsible agents. And then somebody will say, well, look, if some animals, then all animals have rights. Amoeba have rights. Paramecia have rights. Or where's paramecia liberation? Stop the paramecia lab. But I mean, so in other words, the idea is it will reduce the position to absurdity. But you're not committed to that. I mean, you may believe that, but you're not committed to it. The point is this: we don't have sufficiently good reason to believe that some animals have the physical complexity that supports consciousness of the world. I mean, they don't have an anatomy and a physiology that suggests that they're aware of the world, in the world, aware of the world, aware of what happens to them in life. So you're not committed to that. You may believe it, but you're not committed to it. This is where people say, what about roaches? What about, well, I'm sorry, but I mean, I don't think roaches are subjectively present in the world in the way that I think other animals are. But again, other people might disagree with that. The practical implications, as you're well aware, if rights are trumped, that notion of Trump, if respect for the rights of the individual more important than any obligation we have to benefit society at large in particular, then violence to animals is wrong even if we benefit. And it applies to what we eat, it applies to what we wear, what we learn, and what we do for fun. It applies to virtually every aspect of our life. Every aspect, virtually. Tens of millions of animals are killed every year for their fur. Hundreds of millions of animals suffer and die in laboratories. Some people say about 500 every minute, every day. As mentioned earlier, 10 billion animals are slaughtered each year just in America. Nobody really knows how many worldwide. 19,000 a minute. 19,000 a minute. It's like astronomy. Like people talking about light years or something. Hard to get a handle on. Why are animal rights important? Because if animals have rights, as I believe they do, none of this should be happening. Thank you.
Find out more about animal rights by reading the works of Tom Regan, including his latest book, Defending Animal Rights, available through your local bookstore. Rocky Mountain Animal Defense's mission is to help eliminate the human-imposed suffering of animals in the Rocky Mountain region. If you would like to assist in public education, research and investigation, on-the-ground assistance, or legal efforts, please contact us. Or, for more information, please visit our website at armad.org.